Good evening and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. Tonight, my guest is Michelle Bicking, who is running for Governor of Connecticut on the Green Party ticket. Michelle, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Good evening, everybody. So good to spend this brisk Tuesday evening with you. I often include my middle name, Louise, when I'm talking about myself because my mother has always been a very important part of my life, and I like to recognize her wherever I have a chance to. Um, I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, grew up there. I've been in Connecticut for the past 13 years. Um, my day job is a medical social worker, and most of my patients are in hospice. I'm also a certified birth doula, and I have one patient right now who's due any day. My former life has included being assistant manager to restaurants, executive director of three nonprofits, um, first grade teacher, former foster parent. So yeah, it's been an interesting ride to get to this point.
That's definitely eclectic. I admit, I have been everything from a security guard to a tech support rep for Apple, and now I work for a lighting control company. So
Mhm.
I've had a few jobs myself. I
Oh,
impersonate a journalist now and then, or impersonate a pundit now and then.
mhm.
But I mean, this is just something I do, I guess, to stay sane in a difficult world. Um, I'm glad to see a Green Party candidate for governor in Connecticut. Uh, I
Been a while.
I like to see third party candidates. The Green Party usually has the best ballot access of the bunch. I'm always glad to see interesting green candidates for people to find out about.
Hmm.
I know sometimes it's hard to break through the media even locally.
It can be. For us there, we had some ballot access setbacks. Primarily because in Connecticut you have to um, find 7,500 signatures before you're added to the ballot.
Yes.
We could not make that in the time that we were given, which is less than 9 months. So I have applied and I believe was accepted to become a write-in candidate. So the
Gotcha.
process now leading up to election day is to educate people on how to add my name to the ballot, as well as the candidate for Lieutenant Governor, Cassandra Martin.
Um,
Um,
that
but
makes sense.
I'm a believer there's no such thing as a third party. I also don't believe that there's such thing as a minority party. I think
Yes.
that all parties should be treated equitably. And if we had ranked choice voting in state, then we would also have the opportunity to all of us have a better say and better reach to the general
It,
public.
it should work that way.
It
And
should, but
yet
it doesn't.
In Maine, they did shut the Green Party candidate for Senate out of the debates despite ranked choice voting.
Right. Right.
I was actually, I don't like to talk about the stuff I do online too much, but I was an online volunteer for that campaign. I thought that was a good race. I thought that it was one of those situations where the candidate should have absolutely had an even shot, except they weren't allowed in the debates and got no media access. So how is someone supposed to know they're running?
Correct. I was at an End Hate rally, one of several rallies that have been going on throughout the state on Saturday, and everyone who was there admitted that they had never heard of me before. And I said, well, that's intentional. It's a pay to play situation. So, if you don't have the finances or the connections in order to get that level of exposure, it's not going to happen. Um, so yeah, it's very difficult for so-called minor parties
I
to get
was
play.
I was shocked when Howie Hawkins was actually on MSNBC in
Hmm.
2020. And I remember watching, and I was like, wow. And then thinking back, I'm like, well, they gave him a tiny segment on the Friday before Election Day,
Right.
under circumstances that probably aren't going to help him with anybody who hasn't already made up their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very frustrating after the fact. Plus the fact that that's, of course, cable news and not NBC News, where everybody's watching after work.
Right. Right. It's really unfortunate. So, you do what you can. You
If
find opportunities, creative opportunities to reach out to people, and
definitely,
you don't let the specter of what's become of democracy in this state, if in this country, never mind the state, hamper your ability to reach people, to get your voice out.
yeah, I admit that I am sometimes disheartened by what passes for democracy.
Hmm.
I remember a time when we really felt, rightly or wrongly, and I'm going to say wrongly, I think a lot of changes were cosmetic, and that people who felt this way were feeling this way out of wishful thinking more than
Hmm.
anything else. But I remember a time when it seemed like, even though we weren't doing great on a lot of the economic stuff, at least we didn't have to worry too much about the social stuff, because it was moving in the right direction, and the Supreme Court had made the right decision in a couple of civil rights cases that would seem to make things easier for gay people, and potentially easier after another case or two for Black people or trans people, or any other group that's being marginalized, disabled, whoever was next on the list. Because you had that feeling for a while where things are getting better slowly in some areas, and it's a matter of, okay, who's next that things are going to get better for here, and maybe eventually things will get better for everyone.
Hmm.
And instead, that was an illusion. It was at best an illusion, and at worst a deliberate lie.
Hmm. Hmm.
And as a result, we ended up going through the experience of suddenly having to choose between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. I mean, plenty of people, a few people did actually vote green. I will admit I actually didn't vote at all.
Hmm.
Um, but that said, how do you think the person trapped, the person who really feels like it's that false dilemma where you have to choose one or the other, how did the average American voter like that feel about feeling forced to choose between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton?
Well, that's part of the problem, because there are more than two choices. There have
Yeah,
always been more than two choices, but it's the narrative that's pushed on every possible media outlet that you can find, is that you have to make this discrete decision on one evil or next,
yeah,
um, or the other. So, I mean, the same is very apparent in Connecticut, even though the Republicans and Democrats are referred to here as a duopoly, very saliently so. Both candidates are the same person, same background, same intentions, same priorities, and they work for the wealthy 1 to 5%, and the golden part of the state, the Gold Coast of the state, and
yeah.
no one else. So they have band-aids, they have, some delusions of, possibly making things better without actually making any significant changes. But you feel stuck in a trench because that's the only thing that's being offered, and YouTube commercials, on billboards, on, afternoon and evening segments. If that's all you see, that's what you come to believe.
And I'm from California, which when I was a kid was still considered a Republican state.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, don't forget.
Mm-hmm.
And as I started growing up in my teens, it was very clearly starting to be a Democratic state. And then this really interesting thing happened where it really looked like things were turning a corner and we're going to get better in California. And then suddenly the Democrats, who had once been pretty liberal in California, or so it seemed to everyone, were suddenly, Rockefeller Republicans at best. And the Republicans were these terrifying figures out of comic books that seemed designed to either horrify or arouse, depending on who you were and what you were watching. There, you were supposed to either get into their, the only thing I can call it is religious fetishism for white Christianity, coupled with this sort of nastiness towards poor people. And it's sort of weird because while I'm by no means super religious, I'm studied reasonably, and my mom was a Mennonite preacher. And so I grew up hearing quite a lot about Jesus, and it just doesn't seem like this white Christianity being sold by the Republicans and pandered to by the Democrats is what people were talking about when I was hearing about Jesus as a kid.
Well, I grew up in a Jesuit tradition.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church has always been, pretty pronounced in my background. I went to parochial Catholic school, grade school, preschool, high school, considered seriously becoming a nun to the Sisters of St. Joseph, and going to Loyola University. So the image that portrayed of this brown man, for the most part, who was homeless, and putting himself out there in service of those who have been disenfranchised, ignored, oftentimes beaten and ostracized just for who they were or what they didn't have, didn't jive well with the notion of white supremacy wrapped up in the blood of Christ. It just didn't make any sense what was pushed by that particular sector, and the dominionists, the quiverful, they all seem to oppress upon folks this ideal of a caste-based heaven, where white folks are center and are receiving of the best of everything, the true blessing of God, and open arms, warm bosom of Jesus Christ, and I never understood why until recently, when it made sense to me in my adult years that when you're trying to pull from the most base aspects of someone's personality, it has to be crafted in a sense that attached to some form of religious fervor, something that cannot be denied, right?
There's something else too. And it was slow, and it was insidious, and it was not right away. And to be fair, I don't think Jean Calvin would have said some of the things that he did say if he realized how they would have been turned around a few years after he was dead by people who thought, well, what can we do with this? But all the same, the answer is Calvinism. Because the pure Calvinism says there's an elect and there's everyone else. God is perfectly loving and perfectly just. Because God is perfectly just, everyone deserves to go to hell. But because God is perfectly loving, some will be saved.
Right.
And this is where all the trouble comes, because then the next question is, well, how do we know we're of the elect? Now, the proper Calvinist answer, according to Calvin, or according to to the original. Well, you went to Jesuit school. The Augustinian stuff that Calvin was copying. That the church did not later completely follow the same way Calvin did. The next question is, okay, so how do I know if I'm of the elect? And the answer is you don't. That's the point. And then the next question is, well, then what's in it for me? Now, of course, this shows totally the wrong attitude about anything spiritual. No matter how you feel about religion, you don't go into a spiritual experience saying, well, what's in it for me, and expect it to end well. But that's what happened. Well, you don't know who's of the elect. The next question is, well, then what's in it for me? And different Calvinists then had to come up with ways to answer what's in it for me in a way that consistently made sense. And in the end, they came up with, well, you know you're one of the elect because God blesses you in your life. And then people say, well, how does God bless us in life? Well, you're comfortable and well off and you don't have to. And who's that? Well, that only really describes the rich. And so now all of a sudden you go from a biblical Christ who says that it is hard for rich people to get into heaven to a anti-Christ position that you can recognize the saved by their wealth in this world. And I'm sorry for those of you who think I'm cracking hard on Calvinism. I can't help it. They killed as many of my ancestors in Germany as the Catholics did. I can't spare them either. Again, Mennonite. Some of my very distant ancestors were probably in Munster, which was one of the few moments prior to the recent family code that was adopted into the Cuban Constitution, one of the few moments where someone says, okay, fathers don't own their wives and children anymore. A family should be a collective organized around love. And I don't think that is the idea of family that people preaching family values in America are selling.
Well, I like how you phrase that, because they absolutely are selling it, and the product is fear. You know, you're hoping to engage folk on the idea that their life, their livelihood, their whole identity is being taken from them by this giant amorphous other. And sometimes the other looks like me, sometimes the other looks like a refugee, you know, sometimes the other looks like a sex worker, you know, regardless of what it is. Yet at the same time, the same people who are doing the hardest preaching, you know, the zealots of whatever movement, are doing the same thing behind closed doors, and sometimes not even behind closed doors.
And that's the whole thing. You look at that sort of, and I'll use the word for it. People accuse me of overusing the word, but I remember a line in a Mark Miller comic book where two superheroes are arguing. And they're from back in the World War II era. So one of them is real old fashioned, but the other has moved on and is hip and modern, or at least is trying to be. And the one guy says, complaining about everything that's wrong with America. And he says, and there are Nazis in the streets, Nazis. And the other guy says, they don't call themselves Nazis anymore. And the first guy looks at him and he says, I don't care what they call themselves. They're fucking Nazis.
Right.
And I think at some point you have to just call it what it is and start throwing the word Nazism around.
Right. And not be afraid of it. And not be afraid of it. You know, the one thing that you know, hate needs to be, you know, hate is violence. And violence needs to be met with the same set of fervor in order for it to be eradicated.
Or sometimes.
Or sometimes more. I mean, we're overdue for a revolution in this country, and one that actually rattles the foundations of the state. And I think it can be done very proactively and very targeted in its reach.
I think
Um,
that's right.
so, it's a revolutionary act for a single woman with a child, a minor child, to decide to put herself out there in such a public venue um, to inspire others to do the same, as well as to make efforts to really change the overall quality of life of her state's residents, and that's me. Um, I've never been one who shied away from conflict. Um, I'm often been the conflict mediator as a social worker. So it's something that I feel like I'm called to. You know.
I, I admit that I have a great deal of respect for social workers, so I I like that.
Hmm. And we
Um,
sometimes get a bad rep because the social workers you hear about are often attached to child services,
well,
and
and
historically it's been about removing children, right?
and
Mhm.
however, technically, and I know this because my dad worked for San Bernardino County at one point, first in CPS, and then because he did not like it one bit in Medi-Cal eligibility.
Mhm.
Um, California's Medicaid is called Medi-Cal.
Got it.
Um, and the worst part of it is that most of the official state affiliated social workers aren't even social workers. They're
Mhm.
people who wanted to be social workers and didn't get more than a 2 or a 4 year degree. And they got stuck in social services instead of social work. And social services is about saying no and taking things away from people, not saying yes and giving things to people.
Or a step further, allowing people to make decisions about what works best for them, and helping remove the barriers and the blocks for them to get to that place. I mean, that's I'm a facilitator, you know. That's what I do. That's what I do. And
And,
so it's I feel like the impression that people have of social workers and social work as a discipline has changed. And I'm fortunate uh, to be able to witness that kind of change. Um, and we are recognized as a force to be reckoned with, and we can be found in all layers, all levels of government, making and crafting policy, that affects us, in all of us, in one way or the other. So yeah, I haven't gotten any pushback about, from people who think that I can't do the job as far as becoming governor.
well,
When they look at my background, they notice that I'm more than capable. Um, I don't even think either one of the candidates, the duopoly, the Republicans and the Democrats, have a master's degree between them. I'm not sure, but I have two.
well,
um,
and
and the first one's in public administration, and the second one is in social work with a emphasis in gerontology.
well,
So I know my
well,
stuff. You know.
public administration. If you have a degree in public administration, then you already know more about government than either the Republican or the Democratic candidates.
But you and I know, and I'm sure most of your listenership know, that it's not about what you know; it's who knows you.
As an autodidact with no degrees whatsoever, I absolutely know that what I know matters very little.
In the scheme of things, yes. I mean, we have a lot to contribute,
Of course,
um, in raising up the next
I'm
generation.
in the terms of capitalism and economics is the value of what I know is very little because of the lack of credentials. Whereas, and this is depressing, but there are people who are paid to be very smart, who are very easily outsmarted in a venue like Twitter, and they go on and continue to get paid a lot of money to be smart despite repeatedly showing their stupidity.
Mm,
And sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's not.
mhm.
You
What
listen
pains
to,
me more is when I see people who are paid to be dumb,
yes,
and they have a good on head and shoulders. They have the lived and professional experiences, but yet they water down their message and make it seem as if, that's the way to go. That's
Look at
what hurts me the most.
look at the people who are paying them, and this is where it gets.
Right.
Do you remember when Howard Schultz was trying to dip his toe in the water of running for president as an independent, the Starbucks billionaire?
Yes. Yes, Mr. Schultz.
So what was revealed every time he spoke to media in public was that despite the fact that he was a billionaire and a successful CEO and a person who had great standing in the community of the world, so to speak, he was a profoundly stupid man on anything that had anything to do with the real world.
Yeah.
Since he was a kid, because the last time he had actually lived in and dealt with the real world was when he was a kid growing up in the projects, which is why he reminded everyone whenever he wanted to try to connect with ordinary people, hey, I was a kid growing up in the projects.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the problem is, and I'm sure that someone told him this at some point before his candidacy ended, and it may have had something to do with why his candidacy ended. It does not matter how many times Howard Schultz says that he was a kid in the projects once. A white billionaire in no way conforms to the expectations of voters about what a kid from the projects looks like.
My thought immediately when you said that is like, what has he done for kids in the projects?
Exactly.
Wow.
And nothing. And let's keep in mind that he was a kid from the projects at a time when public housing was much more public than it is now.
Mm.
And I'll be blunt, it was open to more white people than at any other time in history. Because that's really what people talk about when they talk about the good old days in the 1950s, that things were pretty decent if you were white.
Pretty much.
And the reason for that was because there was this sophisticated welfare state that existed in the cities and the suburbs, specifically for friends of people in politics.
Mm-hmm.
And this system always worked on the poor in the neighborhoods whose votes were most important to the machine. And much of the Democrats' reputation for helping poor people came from this kind of corrupt machine politics. And if you were white, or if you were one of a very small handful of people in small favored Black communities that had fairly respected voting rights in the 1950s, you might be doing okay.
Mm-hmm.
But the majority of poor people whose votes weren't important to somebody, especially the rural poor in areas where there were still literacy tests or minimum property requirements, you didn't have the same access to any sort of welfare, because the official welfare system wasn't any easier to get into, but the unofficial welfare system hadn't been stamped out yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people who probably wouldn't have qualified for welfare or housing by strict means testing had access to those things through the political patronage network because their neighborhoods were favored.
Mm.
And when we talk about stamping out corruption, it's important to be remembered in all the ways that doing nice things for poor people used to be part and parcel with corruption
Right.
and are connected to machine politics that allow people to make it sound like you're trying to buy votes by doing nice things for people
Mm-hmm.
or by giving people what they need, and forgetting that politicians are supposed to be serving society and not the other way around.
Not serving themselves.
The
Agreed.
trouble, of course, is who is society, which is a whole other question.
I really do think that a lot more can be accomplished if there was no money in politics at all. League
It
of
feels
Women
that
Voters is hosting a televised debate between gubernatorial candidates in the coming weeks. I was not invited. And in many ways, based on their criteria, which is unique to each league, I'm not considered a candidate because I don't have $75,000 minimum at my disposal. Um, I don't have a formal campaign manager who is on staff, like a staff, right?
yes.
So even though I, have write-in status, and the Green Party is the fourth largest party in the state and the country, that isn't sufficient to warrant an invitation. Um, so, again, back to the pay to play. If you have the means financially to put yourself in a position where you can share the stage with other candidates, then it happens. But if you don't, then it doesn't.
That's
And
true.
so for me, one of the biggest factors on making it more accessible to others, who identify by whatever category or whatever party they shall choose, is to remove money from politics. It does
And
no good to anyone.
that's the bare minimum. I mean, if we're going to deal with anything else, we have to get money out of politics.
Hmm.
And not just corporate money, because the Democratic Party carries on full time, uh, 40 hours a day, 5 days a week, full time telemarketing to millionaires to keep the money flowing.
Correct.
And when people say no corporate money, it doesn't matter if they have bundlers and leadership funds and all sorts of other loopholes in the campaign law that's
Hmm.
been blown away anyway by the Citizens United decision.
Correct. Correct. And I learned earlier today that most of the um, healthcare providers in state are nonprofits. Beyond the insurance carriers, most of the actual um, provider network are nonprofits. Yet one of the largest sources of debt is medical debt.
Well,
Um, so it doesn't make any
you
it doesn't make
you know
any sense.
you know the
I mean,
secret about nonprofits?
knowing and being in that world, I can guess where you're going. But go ahead, please proceed.
Well, the secret of nonprofits is there's a whole lot of profit in them.
Yes. Just
Uh,
because you're nonprofit doesn't mean that you're not allowed or
so
don't
so
consider your bottom line and can be
you
aggressive about
you
obtaining
you
funds.
still have to pay your staff, number one.
Hmm.
Number two, because while there is a certain cachet to it, the important people you want running your nonprofit in order to get attention usually have to have enough money to donate themselves and mix with people who they can convince to donate.
Correct.
Then you have the fact that people still expect to be paid the market rate for their work or close to it.
Hmm.
And the market rate for a CEO is disgusting.
Hmm. Is it
And
350 times
and,
larger than the average worker? Hmm.
and while the nonprofit CEO isn't paid anywhere near what the average corporate CEO is, they're still paid a whole lot more than the typical nonprofit worker.
Right.
And of course, nonprofits have loopholes for busting unions that for-profit corporations of the same kind often don't.
That's correct.
I
And I
can
love how the culture within some nonprofits, try to encourage their staff to say, well, you can speak to us directly. You don't
Yeah.
need to use a union or have
Yeah.
a union representative. You can just come to us and we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
To make it seem like you're a troublemaker if you choose to, participate in a union represent. You know what I mean? So
But if you do talk to them too much, you're a troublemaker because you're always
Mhm.
talking to them.
Correct, correct, correct.
And so it's a no-win.
Yeah.
No, I saw how several different political candidates for the Democratic Party in various places in 20 and 21 were outed from their from their presumably blessed nonprofit work as just the worst kind of union busters. There was a candidate for the U.S. Senate in Texas.
Hmm.
There was a candidate in 2021 for mayor of New York City.
Hmm.
People who were trying to make themselves sound, whether they were or were not, like they were the most progressive choice in the field, and yet they were union busting in their own careers.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that was not something that, I mean, you can say a lot about the Democratic Party leadership, but the average Democratic Party voter doesn't want to hear you're a union buster in the primary, and that's
Mm.
not going to go well for you.
This is true. Or that unions have either failed to endorse you,
Yes.
or have come out against you. I mean, that looks really, really bad.
Oh, and that's one of the worst tricks they use
Hmm.
is that the unions, which vary by quality, but depending on the union,
Hmm.
um, some are better than others, some are worse than others, some have more radical leadership, some have more liberal leadership. But I mean, the status quo is that unions negotiate with employers with this sort of alleged mutual idea of the good of the industry and the best for everyone,
Right.
instead of really fighting for the absolute best possible deal for their workers.
Hmm.
And you can agree or disagree, but I feel sometimes like the more the more progressive candidates will often be tagged somehow as anti-labor by more politically suspect unions in order to funnel primary candidates into the most conservative option possible,
Mm.
which doesn't help the Democratic Party, and it doesn't help voters who think they only have those two choices, which is why more people need to know that the Green Party exists, or that the Party for Socialism and Liberation exists, or that the Socialist Party exists.
Right. Or even the Libertarian Party exists. We have someone there is a Libertarian candidate in state, and he also was not invited to any of the debates or the forums where the Republican and Democratic candidate have been invited. Um, it's very, very disturbing. Um, and I intend to make my my feelings known and public about how one-sided it has been in the favor of those who are benefiting the most from having that limited information out there for people to make decisions on their own. So I really also want to again aspire people to know that this could be you as well. You know,
Well,
there's
and
nothing keeping you from running for office, nor
well,
should it.
but and that's really the whole thing, is that if electoralism is going to work, then we need lots of ordinary people to run.
That's right.
If electoralism is not going to work, then we need lots of ordinary people to run to show people that electoralism is not going to work.
That's right.
And so you still need people who are willing to run for office and carry that torch and invite that scrutiny and abuse in order to get the word out.
That's right.
No, I think the more people run, the better.
Mm-hmm.
The more ordinary people run, the better. There aren't, but at the same time, there are financial barriers for ordinary people that are very
Yes.
hard
I mean, they're one of the biggest barriers for me is that it's just me, you know, and I have a little one to take care of.
yeah,
And, unlike the other, at least two of the other candidates, I have a day job that I'm committed to.
yeah.
So, organizing, efforts to be present for people around my schedule has been, nothing short of nightmarish.
I
So I'm grateful for opportunities to kind of connect with people remotely, like I'm doing so with you and your audience.
I am
Um,
always grateful for this. This is one of the things that keeps me sane.
yeah. Um, and then the times that I can actually get out there. I mean, I took my son to the End Hate rally, and I parked him in front with my phone and some headphones, so he can just kind of zone out while I was up there speaking and while he was watching others speaking. And interesting enough, he told me that he was listening. There were times where he took off his headphones. He's 6, so he could listen. And he told me that he was very proud of me. And there's
I'm
nothing like, someone that you've helped usher into this world tell you to your face that they're proud of you. It makes
no,
all of this worth fighting for.
and really, I mean, the next generation is what we're fighting for them
That
to
is
have a
correct.
chance.
And they deserve that chance. It should not be taken from them because, a generation and a half ago, people made decisions that have affected the quality of life moving forward for all of us and led us into this path of extinction for most of the planet. When we talk about climate change, it's not a reckoning for animals and whatnot, flora and fauna. It's a reckoning for humankind. The planet will go on, but we won't go on with it.
What this always reminds me of George Carlin, and I think it's so
Mm.
tremendously important. He says, "We're doing it for the planet, doing it for the planet. The planet will be fine.
And it will be fine.
Humanity's fucked.
Yeah,
The planet will be fine."
absolutely.
I mean, the thing that I find this in a very pessimistic, fatalistic way, the best sign of hope for the future.
Hmm.
There is a set of islands off Australia that sinks every 50 years, 100 years, whatever. Then it comes up again. Now, the last time that it was there, people noticed this specific species of flightless pigeon, flightless duck, some really specific flightless bird.
Like a
And then the
puffin?
island sank. So they were all extinct, right? So then the islands come up again in their next cycle. They've been up for like 20, 30 years now. So not a huge amount of time. This is a really short evolutionary wink.
Yep.
The same birds flew to the same island and confronted with the same food supplies. Within 2 or 3 generations, were flightless again. This evolution in this, the conditions being right,
Yep.
evolution happens exactly the same way.
That's right.
Which is to say, is that, eventually we'll all get another chance at this in some modified form millions of years in the future, but it would be nice if we don't screw it up now.
Right. Right. This is absolutely true. We may have the chance to evolve into something more because we've never stopped evolving. But the way in which entire systems, in terms of on the government level, have been operating, it's not conducive to allowing that to happen for most of humanity.
What gives me hope, and it's a small thing, and people who don't know a lot about what's going on will try to sell it as less than it was. It's, oh yeah, they finally passed gay rights in Cuba. pretending that the United States has actually passed gay rights for all gay people everywhere in the country, and nobody in the United States is persecuted for being gay anymore. But that aside, in Cuba, they amended their constitution to completely redefine family in a forward-thinking and progressive way. Mutual adoption between adults and children. You have to like each other. The thinking of your kids as someone you are responsible for and not property who you have custody of. Because let's be honest, if we really baldly look at the laws in America, kids are a specialized kind of property rather than people with their own innate rights.
That's correct. And we're not signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The United States is one of the 3 nations that are not.
We
also don't believe as a country that housing is a right or food or water is a right.
No. And even the UN lists food as a right, but not water, which shows you the shortcomings of even
the UN itself. That's correct.
Even the UN itself. And it never hurts. Obviously, you're running for governor. International affairs aren't quite as important. But it never.
On the contrary, sir. I mean, the Green Party has global roots.
True.
There's a Green Party in the Philippines. There's a Green Party, and we're all over the place. Which is one of the reasons what drew me to the party in the first place is that the intention is global, and that our fates are intertwined. I like the idea of being able to collaborate with my brothers and sisters across, ethnic persuasions, religious, language differences, and be able to focus on what really matters to the people that we serve.
This is why I'm a very online person, to communicate with all those people in all those different ways with the help of, a translate button and some software, despite only knowing one language and working for a living. It makes me feel like I'm actually able to learn something, which makes in kind, it's easier to teach something if you can learn it.
That's right.
But yeah, anyway, what I was going to say is, as far as international affairs, the United Nations is based on the basic idea of the League of Nations with a specific set of improvements designed to make it more effective.
Right.
What was Woodrow Wilson's purpose behind the League of Nations? His explicit purpose. He told people this when asked flat out.
Are you testing me? Do not test me. I'm going to fail.
Okay, fair enough. Woodrow Wilson said, when speaking to a University of Virginia audience, that the purpose of entering World War I and creating the League of Nations was to save civilization for the white race and ensure that the colonial imperial system, whose various members were fighting over control of Europe, didn't fall apart because its members were going to war with each other.
My apologies to all of my history and social studies and English teachers at this present moment in time, because I should remember that.
They might not have told you. That's the problem in this country. They might not have told you that part.
Well, we're taught propaganda in this country. We're very rarely educated on matters of actual history.
And when if you took the right collegiate courses, you'd hear it, like a college level course on World War I. Just like you hear all sorts of stuff on a college level course on the Civil War, you never learn about it in grade school or high school.
You never learn about any of that. Nope.
Or Reconstruction, even more.
Nope. That I know for certain.
But yeah, so Woodrow Wilson was openly telling white people in 1918 that the purpose of the League of Nations was to preserve white power. And so the whole purpose of the United Nations, even though, to give it credit, it's one of the only venues that the more marginalized nations of the world have to speak in, and you can't, forget that.
Right.
At the same time, it is based on the idea that a specific set of quote unquote Western, quote unquote civilized, quote unquote developed nations that are all pretty white make most of the real decisions at the highest level.
Mm-hmm. The G7 or the G8.
And I mean, is there an African member of the G7 or the G8?
I want to say there's at least one, but I'm not quite sure.
Look.
We do a quick Google.
I always use this. It's so helpful. If you have the internet while you're doing your show, you kind of have to use Google if something comes up, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So that would be, yeah. I'm going on the assumption that the biggest economy in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
South Africa, and if somebody's in the G8 or G7, it would be them.
Mm-hmm.
But let's take a look. There we go. Group of 7.
Mm-hmm.
So the group of 7 are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, with the European Union as a non-enumerated member.
Oh, I thought there was just one. So who's the 8th? The one they refer to G8.
The 8th was Russia. Russia was allowed into the G7, which became the G8 after Yeltsin took over.
Got it.
And that was the means. Russia's membership in the G8. That was one of the means by which Russia was liberalized. And of course, I mean their economy, and not in any good way.
Right.
Because criticism of Stalin aside, the general social justice situation in Russia is worse off now than it was under Brezhnev or Gorbachev.
Unfortunately, yeah. Yeah. I've been reading about how the conscription notice that there have been many Russian men in particular who've been trying to book it.
Yeah, there it is.
And they're finding themselves at the G20? Thank you so much for posting that, because I know there was membership. Thank you.
Yes, that is the publisher, the editor and writer of Leon Trotsky's revolutionary newsletter.
Thank you.
AKA Connor Exum. He was my guest last week and is a friend of the show.
Because I was remembering there was at least one. Yeah.
So the G20, which does not have the same cachet.
Does not.
And right. the only member of the G7 that is not either a white country or a settler colonial country ruled by white people is Japan, which has its own history of certain racial and colonial attitudes towards the rest of the world.
That's right.
And we just had a state funeral for their late Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, who did more than anyone else in my lifetime to try to whitewash Japan's World War II identity and sort of try to completely reframe it as, no, we were trying to uplift Asia in the face of Western imperialism. That's not what the Chinese say.
That's not at all. Not at all. I remember when I studied briefly in Beijing in my last year of studies at Springfield College for my second master's. And the the messaging was very tight. I mean, we weren't allowed to go anywhere that wasn't on the tour. We weren't allowed to speak to anyone who didn't get prior clearance first. Even when we spoke, we had to clear our statements with the staff that was there.
Wow.
And it was fascinating. Even the teachers knew that, even from Western nations that had come there to teach and to study, they knew that they were walking on eggshells when expressing themselves publicly or even in private, because there was no private. There was no off the record. There was nothing that was ever off the record. So it was a fascinating 10 days, to have that lived experience, and I couldn't imagine having to, um, live like that on a daily basis. Granted that there's never been a golden age for non-white folk in this country, of the United States. There's never been a period of my life where my ability to communicate had been so limited, or to interact with others had been so limited, that it mirrored that. I've never experienced that, and I hope to never experience that. You know, so.
And that sort of, and what's interesting about that is that brings up a topic people don't talk about enough, which is, what did the USSR get wrong? What might China be getting wrong now? What could we actually do better if we really had a revolution and wanted to build a better world? And one of the first things that comes to mind for me is something that no less a Soviet apologist than Michael Parenti said himself, which is the bureaucratic generation of Stalin and his close lieutenants, and the bureaucratic mindset of the Brezhnev faction and their chosen successors that ultimately followed him after Khrushchev,
Hmm.
was that while they were very good at meeting the technical challenges of taking care of people's immediate needs and making sure that everything was distributed as well as possible to take care of those bottom two rungs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People in what we in this country would think of as the professional or intellectual classes felt stifled after those first two, because their needs on those first two levels were obviously already met just by their being in the professional or intellectual class.
At least ideally.
And the limits of the Soviet world were such that the fulfillments available under capitalism to the professional and intellectual classes, if you're willing to compromise yourself morally, which was not something that I believe everyone seeing this from the outside, from the perspective of communism, really understood. If we want to be fair to them, maybe they did. Maybe they were just selling out the whole time. But they can see that these needs are fulfilled for people in their same class in the United States or Western Europe in ways that they weren't being fulfilled in the Soviet Union. And Parenti said that was the Soviet system's failure, that the people who were most necessary to make it work, this sort of bureaucratic, professional, and intellectual class, could only be rewarded by corruption and more than their fair share. There wasn't a way for them to openly communicate without barriers or security. And there were some good reasons for that. If you want to look at it from the Soviet point of view, you're fighting a Cold War with the West. Capitalism wants to destroy your system. Because let's not mince words. The Cold War was about destroying the Soviet system, and that's what it did.
Right.
You have a system that's out to destroy yours. You're going to build those fences. You're going to have that bunker mentality. You're going to start clamping down on people because you have to do it. in order to maintain your purity under this ferocious and corrupting, from your point of view, assault.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're visiting China, the reason they're restricting you so much is because they are worried that you will corrupt the socially collective minded Chinese student with individualist, selfish ideas.
That's right. So there's
And
a stereotype.
they have a fair argument that they're right.
They do. I mean, to be honest as well, one of my favorite aspects of the tour was being told that, Americans are barbarians and we have no manners, right? Especially when it comes to acknowledging our elders. The whole notion of filial
Yeah.
piety and the like, right? So one of the things that I always remember, and again, it's my favorite experience to date, was what we were taught, that how to pour tea appropriately. You pour tea for your neighbors before you pour it for yourself, right? And when you went out to dinner as a group, you waited until the eldest person at the table was ready to eat or drink. You did not make any motions toward anything on that table, no matter how appetizing, no matter even if the waitresses or the staff, is encouraging to eat. You wait until the elder is ready. And I remember watching one of my contemporaries, came from somewhere out west, reach for a bowl of something on the table, and we all just shot her a look like, didn't you just pay attention to her?
Now,
And her hand snapped back. It was fascinating to see what that
now I'm going to give you the hard question,
of course.
which is, do you think that our attitude towards our elders here in the West and China's attitude towards their elders says anything is at all anything has it anything at all to do with our very different COVID reactions?
Ooh, that is a really good question. So even in the midst of having discussions about how you take care of your elders and respect their elders, the system of care in at least in the Beijing area where we're exposed to was lacking. There
Mm-hmm.
was truly no proper safety net in order to ensure that the elders were taken care of, and are often abandoned to their own vices. So you
Sure.
may see people in the street going through trash cans looking for food, but I've seen that in the States here as well, you
Yeah.
know. So as far as the COVID reaction, um, that's a really tough one to answer, because I think that at least in state, I mean, Biden has been speaking out of turn in terms of how the disease is actually continues to ravage our communities across the state. And a lot of what's driven in this state in terms of actual policy is influenced highly by the businesses. And they don't want
Yeah.
us to be wearing masks. They don't want us to be working remotely because it affects their bottom line in a negative way. And they have all these beautiful vacant buildings that they need bodies in order to justify having
Yeah.
access to that space, you know?
If we don't
Um,
have people in our building, why are we paying rent for it? Get
are
them
we
back to
paying?
work.
Correct, correct. And my thought is, like, give me the building. I can house so many people with all those vacant skyscrapers in Manhattan. I mean, you can really eradicate homelessness just by filling the one or two buildings
Well,
alone,
I
chronic
can't
homelessness
even
like that.
I can't even remember what the actual name of the building is right now, and I'm not going to Google it because it's more fun to point out that the building formerly known as the Sears Tower in Chicago has had such a chronically bad time filling all the space in that gigantic building that it has changed owners more times than I can count and
Hmm.
changed names at least 3 times.
And it could be put to such good use.
Yeah,
And now I am aware that in Japan, they just recently are opening up their doors to um, tourism, you know.
yes,
And they're one of the last nations to do so of their level, you know.
sure.
But I think a level of protectivism is warranted, and I respect that, because unfortunately, when it comes to people's lives, we really should be more mindful of how we engage each other face to face. I honestly think that the mask mandate should continue, potentially indefinitely, especially when you're in certain spaces, because a
Well,
virus doesn't necessarily go away; it just changes,
and
right?
on top of that, there is a very good case to be made, which all of my disabled friends have made very well, that we are seeing a eugenics campaign against the immunocompromised and anybody with anything that would be considered a comorbidity, which, by the way, includes
You
you
know
and
it.
me if we're healthy people over 40.
That's right.
It doesn't matter if we have any other comorbidities on top of that. Being
Mm-hmm.
a healthy person over 40 is a comorbidity by itself.
Mm-hmm. You know it. You know it.
And that's not something that the people telling you, well, only old folks and sick people have to worry about it. It's only the people with comorbidity. Yeah, being over 40 is a comorbidity. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Having asthma, which my son
Yes.
has.
My wife has asthma. My wife has diabetes. My wife and I are both over 40. You see where I'm going with this?
I totally see where you're going. No one is as unaffected by this disease. It has been,
So
potentially crafted intentionally to be this widespread and wide-ranging.
there is one thing I will say, which is that there are people who can afford to be less affected by it. We are
Yeah.
not there are very few hospitals that have the same treatment Joe Biden got on his 2 cases of COVID.
Or Trump got.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
And
other officials did not. We don't have access to that flawless, socialist care
yeah.
network that they have access to. It's rugged capitalism for the under 5%, but socialism for everyone, from everyone
Well,
above it.
so and my purity strikes here. When it's the rich, it's not socialism. It's the sharing economy.
Mm.
Now,
And when it
one
supports the welfare state.
uh, so this is where this is where there's a disconnect.
Right.
But it comes back to the roots of money, even before capitalism. Have you read any David Graeber?
Heard of him, have not read. Would love to
He
get
wrote
to
a
know.
very good book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years,
Hmm.
which goes over the differing history of debt in various parts of what we would rather laughably call Western civilization,
Hmm.
and compares this attitude about debt to later attitudes about debt inflicted on other people by the West. For instance, a tribe in Nigeria, very close to where a lot of slave trade activity was happening, developed this social mythology about witches who would get their hooks into you and force you to join their organization of witches until you sold all of your family and gave everything you owned and all the people you cared about up to the witches, and
Mm.
then they would eat it all, and then they would eat you too.
And eat you too.
And this was a metaphor for the slave trade,
Mm-hmm.
because the slave trade was something that certain people in positions of hierarchical power thought would benefit them and could be used for their personal benefit.
Right. But it wasn't indentured servitude, and the game was rigged from the very beginning.
Exactly. At which point they ended up doing a great deal of harm to their own societies by becoming useful idiots for the West.
Mm.
But most of them also ended up somehow getting punished for it when they realized too late that this deal was not good for them, and they tried to do something to protect their own interests.
Mm-hmm.
But people very much felt like you were surrounded by supernatural forces that could take everything you cared about from you. And
In
it
many
was
ways, it seemed that way. In many ways, it definitely seemed that way. I mean,
and
the estimate of people that were lost during the Black Holocaust, as some people have referred
yes,
to it, the Great Horror MAFA, some people refer to it, but essentially the trade, the triangle trade,
Yes.
was somewhere between 6 and 12 millions of souls. You know,
Yes.
so I don't. History has never seen that amount of greed
And,
manifest.
and let's not forget that if you leave out the death camp portion of the Holocaust and
Right.
focus on conscript slavery and work camps and concentration camps,
That's right.
then you had a 200-year, no, not quite, 100-year Holocaust almost,
Mm-hmm.
just during the period of American independence,
Mm-hmm.
plus, of course, the colonial slavery before that.
Right.
Uh,
So almost upwards of 300 years. I mean, where most people in this country are just shy of 3 to 4 generations away from that system,
yes,
which worked very well and continues to work in terms of
the,
of our prison industrial complex,
the
and
carceral state,
in
which
terms of
is,
laborers that are brought from different countries to work our fields. Right.
there's no such thing as a prison that isn't for profit anymore.
There isn't, and there's
On
no,
one,
and my understanding is that slavery has just evolved. It never really
yeah,
left.
exactly. The actual private prisons are openly and blatantly for profit.
Correct.
The prisons that are still publicly owned and run are owned and run for the benefits of corporations, to which they don't use this term anymore. This term refers to a practice that is now illegal, but which is still the same thing in fact.
Hmm.
Convict leasing.
Hmm. All those
Every
young men and women that went out
prison,
and fought those fires in California, convictly. $2 an
every
hour, and they can't even take those skills that they learned to go into a career
yes,
um, after they're adjudicated.
because you can't be a firefighter in California with a criminal record.
Cannot.
There's some place you really need to ban the box.
Hmm. But yet you can put your life on the line because the state tells you, and you have no rights as a
Well,
part of the
so
system.
it's kind of sicker than that. It's a very special position that you volunteer for, and you have to be very privileged to get and keep, because you're allowed outdoors
Right.
with and they literally can't do anything to restrict your mobility that would not be safe for you or anyone whose life might depend on you.
Hmm.
So it's a privilege. And those people are considered the elite and the best in this prison hierarchy.
No difference from the house Negro and the field Negro, in my opinion.
Yes. It's same
Dynamic.
same ideas.
Same dynamic. Hmm.
I can't say that, but I agree with you.
I know, I understand, but I can't. That's why I put it out there. Same dynamic. Hmm.
and that's where we are. And of course, because our society is what it is, a higher number of those quote unquote trusty prisoners are white, which is why the book is called The New Jim Crow, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And of course, criminalizing people deprives them of their civil rights in many states still.
Hmm. And one of them is your ability to vote.
Exactly. In some states, you cannot vote while, in most states, you cannot vote while in custody.
Hmm.
In a lot of states, you cannot vote while on parole or probation.
Hmm.
In some states, you cannot vote for a specific period of time after you get off parole or probation.
Hmm.
And in a very unfair handful, including Florida, where this was repealed, but the governor is defying the law, Florida, you can never vote again.
Right. Right.
And so you think about that, and then you think, well, this system disproportionately targets poor people across the racial spectrum and Black people specifically.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like they're trying to disenfranchise poor and Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not on purpose, it's sure a convenient accident if you do want to keep the ruling class white.
That's right.
And if there's one thing that I believe, it's that more people have a restricted country club view of civil rights than a truly egalitarian view of civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. I think also some people forget that, whiteness is its own club, and that there were some members that weren't even allowed into that club. The Irish,
True.
Persians, Italians. They
Many Persians are still not allowed in.
They're not allowed in. Yeah.
People are still talking about Iran like it isn't. And I'm going to go ahead and use the inappropriate term, but I mean, Persia is where Aryans come from. That's literally, I mean, that northern part is literally where it all started.
Right.
As far as westward migrations and migrations into India and all of what became known as barbarian raids. Yes, sorry to disappoint you. Most white people are descended from the barbarians and not the Greeks or the Romans.
Nope.
And it's the ones actually descended from the Greeks and the Romans who were treated badly in the United States. Ireland was, despite the fact that it never officially belonged to Rome, Roman civilization lasted in Ireland longer than anywhere else until it was destroyed by Western Catholics from the mainland of Europe. Alleged Roman Catholics destroyed the last vestige of Roman civilization. Define irony. But yeah, no. And all the groups that have been admitted to whiteness were admitted to whiteness because they did something to sustain it. The best example of being that there were originally 2 5 Points gangs in New York, specifically in Brooklyn, one white and one Italian. The white one, one Irish and one Italian. My apologies. The Irish 5 Points gang became the New York Police Department. And suddenly the Irish were white and the Italians still weren't. And it was through the identification of the Irish with the cop on the street, which is a stereotype you see in almost every old Hollywood movie and every cartoon older than 1970.
This is true.
The friendly Irish cop on the street purchased whiteness for the Irish by beating everyone else's head in.
It's the only club, the only caste club that you can buy your way into.
Yes. Which is how, I mean, the Italians started to be recognized as white in a large-scale, legitimate way, as there was more and more large-scale money that found its way from the mafia to legitimate businesses.
That's correct. That's right.
And so, and the simple fact is that some groups have not been given that same offer to trade. Indigenous people are still on reservations.
And some reservations don't have access to running water, even in 2022. Yeah.
And Black people are still classed by cops as poor people until they prove otherwise, regardless of their real class status.
That's right.
And we all know how cops treat poor people. And that's why the plurality of prisoners the plural majority of prisoners in the system are white, but black people are disproportionately represented because there is a broad targeting of the poor that allows people to say, well, see, we're not racist, we're hurting white people too, when really it's about eugenics. They want to get rid of everyone who doesn't meet their standards, and the poor are part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the elderly, and the disabled.
And the disabled. Yeah.
And I know it's getting late for you, so I will go ahead and start thinking about wrapping up. But do you have well, actually, there's a good question here.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually good. So apparently there are, according to Leon, there are billions in the governor's budgets that are allocated for renters but aren't actually used. Will you immediately open those funds?
Yes, and I also noticed that there's a trend towards dumping funds like from the legalization of cannabis-related products into the general fund, and I would oppose that. I think that the groups that are most affected by the war on drugs should be the recipients of said funds received from the legalization efforts in state that are well underway, but still
Right.
moving at a snail's pace. So yes, my intent, and this is not just working as a clinician with a predominantly older population who are on a fixed income. Putting that aside, just knowing that there's a huge housing crisis in our state for those who are over the age of 65, as well as for families and individuals who are well below the poverty limits established by the federal government. And to be able to provide housing for them that is both income based and affordable to their family is a huge priority for me. So, yes, I'm absolutely vested in that commitment.
I imagine, and I could be wrong, I'm not as familiar with New England.
Hmm.
I know that Connecticut is someplace people go when they don't want to be in New York anymore.
This is true, and it's long been a safe haven for those who want to escape the grind of the city and have a couple of acres and a colonial house, and
Mhm.
but still maintain the ties of the community and of the folks that they've made in New York. So you have a state that, on a whole, on paper, looks like it's doing very well financially, but most of the wealth is concentrated in a very one county of the state, and the rest of the state is incredibly segregated by economic,
That
socioeconomic,
that
as well
sounds
as quote
that
unquote
sounds a
racial
lot
ties.
like Oregon here,
Yeah.
where the majority of the population and the majority of the wealth is concentrated around two cities and specifically in one county around Portland.
Yep. It's the same. Yeah, absolute same. So
And with
of course
that,
they are against any kind of progressive tax endeavors, and both parties are not interested in revamping the tax code. But I am, because that particular county does not pay its quote unquote fair share in taxes, and that needs to be remedied.
it really does. And let's remember that tax codes are written to benefit the accountants more than anyone else right now. And only the rich can afford accountants, or at least the good ones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
But the poor can make a stink about it. So there's
yes,
still more of us than them. Um, so that's
every
where strength lies in terms of mobilizing, around particular causes or needs for the state, is to move as a block. That's how we can make a difference.
yes, and everybody needs to make their voice heard if they can, because it's not going to get better unless we're willing to be our own heroes. There's not a savior waiting to give us a bunch of rights. Yes, they've taught us that in this long history from Lincoln down, that rights are something that the government bestows on people. That's not how it actually works.
Rights are something that are fought for in the street. in the
all
boardroom, wherever.
all too often the government recognizes rights that someone has already claimed for themselves
Mm-hmm.
when it's already done and the government is just saying, okay, yeah. And even then they can take it away again as people are finding out.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what the Roe versus Wade decision was
Right.
taking away a right on a guaranteed federal level. And why was it not guaranteed at law before then?
Because it was a great fundraising ploy
For both sides.
for both sides.
And because the Democrats got into this headspace where because they weren't really going to codify the right because it was too good for fundraising,
That's
they
right.
had this idea that the Republicans weren't really going to take it away because it was too good for fundraising.
That's right.
But no, it turns out that the Republicans' base actually expected a promise to be kept on this issue, and they specifically chose to nominate Trump over all the other choices who were people they felt had lied to them on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But one of the fastest ways to control a community is to take away the rights and abilities to express themselves of women and children.
Yes.
Whether it's forcing them to wear hijabs or presenting codes of conduct or taking them out of schools so they can better align themselves with being proper wives.
Making
I mean, regardless of what it is, the fastest way to do that is to take away the rights and abilities to just move freely of women and children. So
they
there is a playbook involved, and they're following the playbook.
one of the things that happened in Iran, and it fits with this same playbook, is that they doubled tuition for women in the university system, but not the men,
That's right.
which puts an unfair burden on families trying to keep a girl in school,
Hmm.
which means that families who have to choose are going to choose to send the boys to school and not the girls,
And not the girls.
which takes
Yeah.
you right back to uneducated, an property sort of relationship between men and women rather
Hmm.
than any sort of liberation for anyone.
Hmm. And I wanted to add, just my mention of, of wearing the hijab. That is always a choice, right?
It is in
What a
that
woman
is
decides
the
to
whole
put on her
point.
body, to take off her body, that is always a choice, and that should not be mandated by any authority
No,
other than
and that's
their
the
own
whole
connection to the divine, right?
the whole
Um,
point of religion is that if it is forced on you, it is meaningless
hmm.
because you have to have faith.
That's right.
And if it is torn away from you, that is a violation.
That is a violation. Hmm.
Now, I could go on and on and on about my opinions.
I'm digging it, man. I'm truly digging it.
I have I have many opinions when it comes to religion. My mother was a preacher. I believe more in the Munster school of Anabaptism than I believe in the strictly pacifist Mennonite school of Anabaptism preached today.
Got it.
Um, I believe that it is our duty as a society to do something about injustice.
Yes.
And to me, injustice is not a 10-year-old girl having an abortion. I mean, giving birth to a child because her uncle raped her. Um, I don't think justice is a 16-year-old girl marrying her father's pastor with parental consent. I I don't think justice is ever something that is taken out of the hide of the poorest and most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Justice is something that has to be based on some principle of fairness, or it's not just.
Or it's not just.
And people say, well, life isn't fair. And the answer to that is, well, why not?
Why not? Why can't it be?
And if life isn't fair, doesn't that mean people have to be?
Mahatma Gandhi said that we should live simply so others may simply live.
Yes, that's a good way to put it, too.
And I agree with that wholeheartedly, even though the man had some issues of his own, right?
There was a snarky quality even to that saying, because of the caste weight on what he said.
That's right.
When Gandhi met when Gandhi met Dr. Ambedkar, who was the great spokesman of the untouchables in India,
Yes.
he said, "You have a university degree." And Dr. Ambedkar said, "Yes, I do."
Mm-hmm.
And Gandhi said, "Well, wasn't that a great waste of your talents? Couldn't you have found a better way for your people to beg and thereby bettered your whole class?"
Mm. Mm.
And that just shows where people's weaknesses are, especially when it comes into an area like religion.
Absolutely.
And if religion is to truly be something that liberates and does not chain, which is what the Christ in the Bible was supposedly promising, a liberation.
Mm-hmm.
If religion is to be liberating and not chaining, then justice has to move up from the bottom and be hardest felt by the people at the top.
Yes.
And I have a lot of problems with capital punishment. And I think China overdoes capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't disagree with their idea that if anybody deserves capital punishment, it's CEOs and government ministers who screw around with the people's money.
Yeah, they don't mess with folk when it comes to that. That's for darn
They
sure.
don't. They just recently executed a government minister for bribery. He took
Mm-hmm.
millions of dollars in money. He got caught.
And got caught. Mm-hmm.
I
There
mean,
was
at the
another one that had gotten
very
some jail time. He was supposed to be executed, but got jail time instead. Very fortunate.
very fortunate.
Very
At the very least, China has a system whereby people who get caught get punished for corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a low bar, but we don't have that.
No, we don't, and I didn't realize until I was watching reading something on in an article about how even the Supreme Court does not have a code of ethics.
The Supreme Court does not have a code of ethics. It is assumed that the Supreme Court is already going to be ethical, or they wouldn't be in that position.
Well, I think
And of course,
it's one of those cases where redundancies would make sense.
and yet, so here's the whole thing, though. First, we're talking about lawyers. And second, we're talking about old white people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to be stereotypical about my own people here. I can't help it. Would you trust most old white lawyers?
I don't trust the opinion of one person. I need to get more than one.
And that's fair. But I mean, and this is my point of view, and that was well answered, by the way. My point of view is that, professionals of a certain experience, secure in their position, are the least trustworthy people in the world because they know what they can get away with.
That's right.
And if they think they can get away with it, you can't trust them.
Right.
And part of it is because of capitalism. They work in a system where their time is their money
Mm-hmm.
and they're being paid for their skills. So to they don't want to be giving freebies. That's not good for their bottom line in the end, just like any other worker.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that there's a sort of a capital there because there are people who need that specialty labor and don't have access to it.
Have access to it, correct.
And so that sort of works as a sort of a natural outside source of capital
Mm-hmm.
if you have a peer group in which you can trade on it.
Right.
And and it's very important to notice that those peer groups are uh, very carefully curated.
Mm-hmm.
People decide who gets into the right peer group.
That's right. That's right. And the strength of those boundaries, those barriers, is what makes it special. Like it's
Exactly.
all gated community that the passcode is only given to a certain few.
I
Yeah.
think that's a very good analogy because the gated community is increasingly the symbol of comfortable people who don't have to care what happens outside the gates.
But yet still has to rely on the labor to come in and
Yes,
mow their grass and cook their food, and because they
yes.
can't do it themselves, they won't do it themselves. I mean,
They all,
that is the history of the United States, and from its founding, it was essentially a group of people who didn't chose not to do it themselves, and bring others to do the work and kill off who was here because they wouldn't comply.
and and this is
Hmm.
the whole purpose in the eyes of many. Virginia is the best example. The whole South is still a good example. It's why the Civil War happened because of this difference. But to many people, the American colonies were a place where they could come and live like a nobleman. If they could afford the lifestyle, they could do it. They could have they could buy slaves to be their peasants. They could have indentured servants or slaves to be their servants in their home.
That's right.
They could have a small community of professionals and tradesmen dependent on their business, which gave them power in the community. They
That's
could
right.
have all the things that noblemen could have in England if they could afford it.
Hmm.
And you see this desire, and it never goes away, even
I mean,
in,
it's been subsumed by the American dream, that house with
yeah,
the one picket fence. I mean, the idea in order to truly be free and to make it is to be of a certain financial standing, you know,
and
and the king should not be attached to that. You should
to
not
have
have to be able to be of a certain wealth class in order to have the right to raise your children with free from violence,
and
to live where you choose.
and you shouldn't have to wait for a quote unquote dignified retirement to
That's
be
right.
comfortable and to
That's
put
right.
time into your personal pursuits. There needs to be a balance.
There used to be. There used to be a balance. My parents had a taste of that for a time, but I have never known that. There is no balance.
Yeah,
There is no
no,
balance.
I
There's
feel like,
never enough time to have an actual life outside of work,
well,
and you tend to over-identify with it.
I carved this out and we're losing sleep by doing this. I mean,
Well, that's what I tell my folks. I mean, when they tell me that they have no time to do X, Y, and Z, and I say, well, you make time. You force its hand
yeah.
because you deserve it. You're worthy of the time that you take and give to yourself because you said it contributes to your sanity and contributes to all of us,
Yeah.
our sense of belonging, our sense of place, our whole identity when we make time for ourselves. I mean, the way this country treats being able to have free time as a luxury, or you're being a slacker, is just
And
really, really
and
disturbing.
once you have enough time for yourself, you start to have time for other people
That's right.
that you didn't have before because you're not as tired.
Hmm. Hmm. So it's
And
worth it.
and that's where community starts, where you start to get you start to depend on each other and trust each other for those things because you know each other.
Hmm.
And this gets me back to Graeber because we went off the topic before I got where I was going, which I do, and it's my fault.
I'm West Indian.
Money
It's natural for me, so no worries there.
money started as a substitute for trust
Ooh.
in what Marx called primitive communism, and which, according to Graeber, who is, let's not forget, an anthropologist, he's someone who studied the actual science of how people lived in the
Hmm.
time before we really could imagine the way they lived,
Hmm.
because we have all sorts of things now that they didn't. I mean,
Hmm.
every time I think about people building the pyramids, it boggles my mind. It doesn't shock me that there are people who thought it was so impossible only aliens could have helped people do it,
Right. But
because it boggles the mind.
that was humanity.
Exactly.
Hmm.
That was literally humanity as a collective. And
Hmm.
you can say that that was a waste. And it was tremendously costful in blood and labor. But with the technology we have now, we can coordinate like that without the waste of blood and labor. People
Hmm.
say, well, central planning never works, but the pyramids were centrally planned.
That's
If
correct.
you can use central planning for ill like that, then you should be
Hmm.
able to use it for good with everything we have now.
Hmm.
And
It is possible.
people want to scare us with automation. Imagine if workers had control of how that automation was used.
Ooh, I can imagine. I could totally imagine.
And imagine if workers had control over who reaped the benefits of that automation.
That's right.
And people make jokes about fully automated space communism, but is it really that big a stretch? I mean, Cuba's just proved we can have gay communism, and
Mm,
the USSR proved we could get started on space communism. So
right.
fully automated gay space communism doesn't seem impossible.
I want that on a T-shirt. Somebody out there make that happen. I'll buy it. I'll buy a couple of them.
I'm
Fully
sure
automated
someone
gay
has
space
one out
station.
there by now because it's a fairly popular term, both by people who
I would
use it
rock it.
derisively and by people who think it sounds like a great idea.
I think it's amazing. Are
I
there any other questions from your folks that would like to be answered before I pass out?
Yes. Does anybody have any final questions for Michelle, please?
I hope I made a good impression.
Well, this is actually worth bringing up again and coming back to since it's here. It's in a couple parts.
Hmm.
And so even if the Green Party is global, the role of a governor as a political entity is executive only in his or her state. So I'm unclear exactly how the role of the Green Party's global nature will actually work out.
Um, well, it's something that I think should be pursued because here's a perfect example. Delegates from Cuba are only allowed to come to New York and specifically the UN
Yeah,
to speak their piece. However, for the first time in history, delegates were allowed out of state to come to Connecticut.
yeah,
So we got to speak to members of the Green Party and others, got to speak directly to representatives of the Cuban government about the family code and other issues, including the embargo facing themselves and sanctions in Venezuela.
yeah,
So it is possible for, as the executive of the state, to host such gatherings to allow for interface between just the common folk and folk from around the globe, and see if there's meaningful ways that we can collaborate without bringing in the Fed's disapproval for such interactions, right? Because that's one boundary that you don't want to overstep. the fact that a state is negotiating terms or having any kind of direct contact with a country that is on their watch list. But it's still very possible. Um, to be globally minded makes sense in this day and age because there are a lot of things, including climate change, that are affecting us around the world. Movements that we can support around the world in our own way.
I know,
Um,
I know real Trotskyists who would say that the only way to defeat climate change is with global central planning, and they
yeah,
might be right.
and I'm a believer in that. So I support my brothers and sisters and those who identify in any which way they choose,
Yeah.
non-binary and the like, anywhere around the world in their individual struggles. And I want them to know that I'm connected to them. You know,
And that leads into a kind of a tough question, and this will be the last one. So this will be the hard one of the night.
I'll try my best.
Since you mentioned the Global Green Party, the Green Party has not been anywhere near government in the United States, of course,
Mm,
but has participated in coalition governments in other countries, Canada, Australia, Germany, especially Germany.
mhm,
The German Green Party, while it was part of a coalition government, made a decision to support the war in Afghanistan. What is your feeling on the idea of any branch of the Green Party making decisions like that again in the future, especially here in the States?
I think we are peace building. We're all about peace building. So any support of a war, especially when you have such major players involved, is counterintuitive to our mission and our vision. So I think that's where different caucuses and different branches of the Green Party can step up and say, we don't necessarily support this at our level. Um, so yes, that is a very tough question because you have to respect the decision-making practices of other parties elsewhere. But if you not but because that refutes everything that I just said. We still need to be mindful of the fact that the party is about war solves nothing, and we understand that that is the case.
And
There are other ways to bring about systems change without actually using war as a cover for it, because
and
war only serves to enrich the wealthy and impoverish everyone else.
and I agree with that. And I would further say that sort of decision is one of the clearest examples of how having a seat at the table in a liberal democratic state carries with it a lot of risks and a lot of dangers that feel very necessary to keep that seat at the table.
Hmm.
Because you know that someone in that Green Party thinking about the coalition government is saying, we have to do this to stay in the coalition, or we won't be able to accomplish anything else. And then somebody else is saying, but if we do this, it's all going to be about the war. Nothing else is going to get accomplished anyway. And then the person, but nothing's going to get accomplished if we're not in the coalition. This
Hmm.
way, at least there's a chance, which, by the way, and this is my final thought, was exactly the justification that so-called socialists all over Europe used to side with their countries during World War One.
Right,
And look what happened there.
right.
It has been all downhill since.
Whenever you attempt to compromise your own integrity, that is the end. That is the outcome. It never works. It never
And
works.
and I think we're in the same. We definitely agree there. Do you have any final thoughts? Any websites to promote? Anything
Yeah,
that you want people to think about?
I do. And honestly, that was a very beautiful segue because my campaign is called Room at the Table.
I
It's
like.
inspired by, Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Chisholm about, we collective, we need to be at the table where all decisions are being made. It cannot be left to a select few to make those decisions. I can be reached on Facebook and Twitter at MLB, which are my initials, Mary, Larry, Bart, CT Green. My website is humble as it is. Please forgive me. Room at the table, the number 4.us. Room at the table, the number 4.us. My phone number, which is a Google Voice phone number, so feel free to call me and leave a message if you so choose. It's also the fastest way to get at me outside of email. It's 860-255-8189. 860-255-8189. And my email is my last name, Bicking, B as in boy, ICKING dot Michelle with 2 L's, because there's a lot of hell in me, at gmail.com.
I fell behind there, so I apologize for not getting those in the chat. But if you are watching on video, rewind, please. Be kind to yourself. On that note, I've got you both. I've got the Facebook and Twitter and the website in there.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you very much for your time tonight. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Let me know if you want to come back, please.
I can tell you now, I do.
Then I will remember that. I have times when I want 2 or 3 people on a show at once sometimes, and you looks like you are someone who could definitely add to that. So I appreciate it.
And I can hold my own. But thank you again to everyone who allowed me to share in your presence this evening.
Thank you, everyone, who watched and contributed. I always appreciate it. Everybody have a great night from both of us. And like always, I'll tweet at you.